Mr. Deputy Speaker, the reality is that whatever the Chancellor claims today, austerity is not over. And far from building a strong economy, 8 years of austerity has damaged our economy, delayed and weakened the recovery, and endlessly postponed fixing the deficit. Unnecessary austerity has caused real hardship to millions of our fellow citizens, held down living standards for the majority, and failed on its own terms. Mr. Deputy Speaker, people have had enough.
Order. Just sit down. Order.
Wants to kid the public he's ditching it.
Can I just say that we heard the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I expect to hear the Leader of the Opposition. Those who may have been put themselves in a position thinking I can't see them, yes, I can. And I don't want to hear any more. I want to hear the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the same way that your constituents do. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister pledged austerity is over. This, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a broken promise budget. What we've heard today are half measures and quick fixes while austerity grinds on. And far from people's hard work and sacrifices having paid off, as the Chancellor claims, this government has frittered it away in ideological tax cuts to the richest in our society. This budget won't undo the damage done by 8 years of austerity and doesn't begin to measure up to the scale of the job that needs to be done to rebuild Britain. The government claims austerity has worked, so now they can end it. But that is absolutely the opposite of the truth. Austerity needs to end because it has failed. Just 2 years ago, he forecast growth of 2.1% next year and the year after. Today, he boasts he's created robust economic growth, but the forecasts have been dropped to just 1.6% next year and 1.4% the year after. Economic growth in the first half of this year was the slowest since 2011. The last year we had the lowest growth of any major economy. This is not a strong economy, but a weak one, with chronically low investment, low wages and low productivity. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the uncertainty caused by this government's shambolic handling of Brexit is making things even worse. The warnings come...
Order. Mr Bowen, Mr Philp, I expect better. You're very obviously right in my sight, so I suspect you either go quietly out of the chamber if you can't behave. Jeremy Corbyn.
Very good. The warnings come from across the economy, the car industry, farming and food, road haulage. UK manufacturing is currently in recession. So much for the much vaunted March of the Makers. Mr. Deputy Speaker, they said austerity would mean the deficit would close by 2015. Today, the Chancellor has confirmed it will still be there 9 years later in 2024. Even now, great chunks of the deficit have simply been palmed off to others, not eradicated, moved into the accounts of NHS trusts, shuffled onto the books of local councils that have collapsed, with many more on the brink, and most worryingly and frightening for many people, loaded onto the very fast rising levels of personal and household debt. For too long, the party opposite peddled the myth that the last Labour government crashed the economy by overspending on public services. As if, Mr. Deputy Speaker, investing to bring health spending, as the last Labour government did, up to European levels had caused the global financial crash. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe that spending on public services is an investment that benefits the health of our people and the economy of our country. This morning, the Health Secretary said that it would take a generation to achieve parity of esteem of mental health and refused to say whether the money was ring-fenced. And that money is only half of what leading mental health experts say is necessary. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the impact of austerity on our people's health is more than the NHS funding. Improvements in life expectancy are stalling for the first time in modern history, and in the poorest areas of our country, life expectancy is actually falling and child mortality is rising. The National Health Service, our precious National Health Service, is a thermometer of the well-being of our society. But the illness is austerity, cuts to social care, failure to invest in housing and slashing of real social security. It has one inevitable consequence. People's health has got worse and demands on the National Health Service have increased. 1.4 million elderly people not getting the care they need. Tory cuts have taken £7 billion, Mr Deputy Speaker, from social care budgets. Today's announcement is a drop in the ocean, both for adult and child social care. And at this time of rising demand, nurse numbers are falling, GP numbers are falling, health visitor numbers are falling, and there are 10,000 vacancies for doctors in our National Health Service. Under the last Labour government, the NHS budget averaged an increase of 6% a year. That's been slashed to just 1.4% under this government. The Health Foundation says the government's much heralded extra money for the National Health Service is, and I quote, simply not enough. While the IFS says funding at this level will only maintain current levels. And let's remember what the current levels are in the NHS. Record waiting times at accident and emergency.
Mr Hoare, I think we know better. We caught each other the eye before. I won't want to catch it again. Seriously, you might think Halloween's for screaming. It is not what I want to hear in this chamber. General Corbyn.
4.3 million people on National Health Service waiting lists, longer waits to start cancer treatment. We need to go further, which is why, as we pledged in our manifesto, Labour will raise taxes to the highest earners to fund an increase above the government's baseline. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not only the National Health Service that is in crisis. Defence spending has actually been cut, the size of the army has been cut by a fifth, and whilst we welcome the donation based on VAT gains to commemorate the armistice and 1.7 million more for educational programmes to ensure people learn the horrors of the Holocaust. And I join with the Chancellor in absolutely condemning the horrific and vile anti-Semitic and racist attack that occurred in Pittsburgh over the weekend. We stand together with those under threat from the far right, wherever it may be, anywhere on this planet. The Conservatives used to claim to be the party of law and order. Now they can't even maintain law and order in our prisons. Assaults at record levels as depleted staff try to cope with a difficult situation. And our streets are less safe too. Police numbers are down, violent crime is up, and convictions are down. Chief constables are warning that criminals are taking advantage, and police officers are having to take the government to court. The police officers taking the government to court just to get a pay rise. After 8 years of austerity, firefighters today are paid £6,700 less than they were 10 years ago. Nurses, £4,750. Teachers, £4,650. Every public sector worker deserves a decent pay rise. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, 60% of teachers are not getting it. Neither are the police nor the government's own civil service workers. Cleaners and security guards in the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Business still aren't even getting the London living wage. Mr Deputy Speaker, the gap between those at the very top and the rest is not closing, it's growing. The pay of chief executives of our biggest companies rose by 11% this year, paying themselves 145 times more than the workers in the companies that they lead. At the other end of the scale, 6.3 million workers are paid less than the real living wage, up 300,000 in the last year alone. The very lowest earners and insecure workers on 0 hours contracts or short hours contracts will not benefit from the increase in the threshold, and they are the very people being punished by the cuts still hardwired into universal credit. The Chancellor boasts of a balanced approach. But what is balanced about cutting social security for disabled people or slashing services to the bone? But when by the end of this Parliament they will have doled out £110 billion in tax giveaways to corporations and the super rich. Meanwhile, in the real world, homelessness has more than doubled, fewer people able to buy a home, household debt rising, child poverty is up now to over 4 million and rising, and more disabled people are living in poverty also. Far from tackling the burning injustices, as the Prime Minister said her government was going to do, they have actually made them worse and increased the injustices in our society. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission warned just last week that Britain is becoming a two-speed society, all right for the richest few and failing for the many. This government is harsh on the weak and feeble with the strong. They labelled good people scroungers and skivers while they imposed punitive sanctions, demeaning assessments and a benefits freeze, none of which has been reversed today. The universal credit is causing increases in poverty, food bank use, rent arrears and homelessness. When even the Work and Pensions Secretary admits that some people will be worse off, and the architect of universal credit says the system is underfunded, then it was inevitable the Chancellor would have to act, though he is only reversing barely half of the cuts made. However, the problems of universal credit are also structural, harming the self-employed, lone parents, people with larger families and survivors of domestic abuse. That is why we believe the rollout must be halted immediately. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since 2010, 86% of the cuts through tax and benefit measures have come from women. And there was not even recognition, let alone money set aside, for the women born in the 1950s who've been denied pension justice. Women in Britain today have just 1/5 of the pension wealth of men, in part because of the grotesque gender pay gap, which at current rates will not close until 2073. And there was no extra money to fund women's refuges, a lifeline for women fleeing from domestic abuse. Since 2010, almost 1/5 of all refuges have been forced to close. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, months after the scale of the Windrush scandal became clear, the Chancellor has failed to set up a hardship fund for those affected, let alone the compensation scheme for the hundreds of people wronged by the Prime Minister's nasty and perverse hostile environment. And we heard no guarantees for older people. Free TV licences for the over 75s remain at risk by the government that threatened to tear up the triple lock, take away the winter fuel allowance from millions and force people in need to pay for care at home. Mr. Deputy Speaker, a country that fails its young people is failing its own future. Schools' funding per pupil has been cut by 8%. The college budget has been slashed and the adult skills budget has been hacked by 45%. And there are 123,000 children in this country living in temporary accommodation, causing them unbelievable levels of stress and uncertainty and consequently often underachievement in schools. Children's services face a £2 billion funding gap. We now have the highest number of children being taken into care since 1985. Last Saturday, I visited North City Children's Centre in Norwich, threatened with closure due to council cuts. With too many children in Sure Start centres already closed, the users of that wonderful centre were very frightened of their future because they had benefited, like so many others have in so many other parts of the country, from the great achievement of the last Labour government, which was children's centres and the Sure Start initiative all over the country. Spending on youth services has fallen by 62%. 600 youth centres have closed. There are 3,500 fewer youth workers. The UK, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the only major global economy in which investment is falling. UK business investment is the lowest in the G7. This failure to invest means Britain's productivity is 15% lower than major economies. Public sector investment is over $18 billion lower than it was in 2010. Britain is the most regionally unequal country in Europe, with 6 of the 10 poorest regions in Northern Europe in this country. And the government reinforces these disparities. Let's just take an example. When it comes to transport funding, the North receives $2,500 less per person than London, while people in the Midlands get $1,900 less. So much for the Northern powerhouse and the Midlands engine. Local economies are also struggling, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over 100,000 retail jobs have been lost in the last 3 years. There are 25,000 boarded-up premises across Britain. A visit to many of our high streets is to see roller-blind shutters on shops that are being closed because of job losses and the problems they face. The Chancellor's business rate announcement today only unpicks his own disastrous revaluation last year. And the Chancellor has again delayed slashing the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals. But he will not solve the crisis on our high streets until he firstly tackles the institutionalised tax avoidance of big online retailers. His digital services tax announced today is too little and too late. Secondly, the Chancellor must tackle the levels of household debt driven by low wages. High streets won't thrive until people have money to spend. So we hope he will endorse our call for the minimum wage to be a real living wage of at least £10 an hour by 2020 and removing the discriminatory youth rates from the system. Mr Deputy Speaker, this Chancellor has again failed to back Labour's plan to create a national investment bank with regional development banks. Today's announcement on broadband investment is a very small step, but Britain ranks 35th in the global rankings of broadband speeds. Currently, just 2% of UK premises have full fibre broadband compared to 80% in Spain and 100% in South Korea. This government still lacks any meaningful strategy for creating high-skilled jobs in every region and nation, and failing abysmally to invest in the industries of the future necessary to tackle climate change. The IPCC report this month was clear on the consequences. We can only avoid climate catastrophe if we act now. The government's response has been to cut support for our solar industries, losing 12,000 jobs in the process, slash the building of onshore wind, cut subsidies for electric vehicles, sell off the Green Investment Bank, and instead to back fracking in the face of overwhelming local and scientific opposition. 10 years ago, it was a Labour government that passed the Climate Change Act, world-leading legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. This government is not even on target to do that. Clean energy investment fell 56% last year, and the UK produces less of our energy from renewables than Germany, Spain, France or Italy. This government is, I believe, Mr Deputy Speaker, failing to protect our environment and, in doing so, failing to protect all of our futures. The extra $500 million announced today to help the government cope with Brexit is not about planning, but about panic. And that panic is very deep-rooted. Yesterday, the Chancellor said another budget would be necessary to set out a new economic strategy in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This morning, the Prime Minister said all these spending commitments are funded irrespective of a deal. It's very clear, Mr Speaker, if they can't agree a good deal with the EU, it's because they can't agree a deal amongst themselves in the Cabinet or in the Tory party. So, as we approach the crucial stage of the government's bungled Brexit negotiations, we face a choice about the sort of economy we want. Some on the benches opposite fantasise about taking Britain down the road and the path to being a Singapore-style tax haven with a race to the bottom in rights and protections. That must be rejected outright. What we need is an active government that will invest in our people in every region and every nation of our country, that will use the wealth we create to fund world-class public services. What's needed, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a real break with austerity and a government committed to raising investment across the board to rebuild our economy, communities and public services. That is a route to a country that could work for all. Austerity is not over, and the quick fixes and half measures we've heard today do not begin to measure up to the scale of the job that needs to be done to rebuild Britain.
Chair of the Select Committee for Treasury, Nicky Morgan.